Hey everybody, this is Miguel Benitez helping you on your search for thoughtful Christianity. And today I have a special guest with me. I have Dr. Donald Williams, who is the R.A. Forrest Scholar and Professor of English at Toccoa Falls College in northern Georgia. Is that right? Northern Georgia? All right, very good. And he has recently released two books. One has been out for a little bit, Deeper Magic. And can you remind me of the subtitle of that again?
The Theology Behind the Writings of C.S. Lewis.
The Theology Behind the Writings of C.S. Lewis. And I know that one is one that I have been interested in particular. I actually just recently heard a podcast in which Dr. Williams was interviewed regarding the context of that book. And my understanding is that basically Lewis's theology has kind of been laid out for us in systematic categories. And Dr. Williams goes on to interact with the theology of Lewis, both kind of praising the good things that we can learn from Lewis while perhaps critiquing some of the problem areas.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then most recently, you have a new book that came out, An Encouraging Thought, The Christian Worldview in the Writings of J.R.R. Tolkien. And could you possibly just let our viewers know what do you cover in that text?
Well, it's basically a companion to the Lewis book, but because Tolkien doesn't really address the whole gamut of systematic theology the way Lewis does, I couldn't really do a book on Tolkien's theology, so it's more the biblical worldview in Tolkien. And so I go through mainly The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but also The Silmarillion and the essay on fairy stories, and I look at the ways in which Tolkien's biblical worldview comes through in those stories. I contrast the strong way it does there with the distortions of it that are created by Peter Jackson in the movies, which serves as a foil to kind of bring out in greater relief what Tolkien was up to. I first encountered Tolkien the summer before my senior year of high school. That was the summer of 1968. My goodness, that's 50 years ago. And I just devoured it. And this first thing I did after I finished it was to go back and read it again, including every word of the appendices. And later, I'm thinking back and asking myself, why did I respond so strongly to that? And one of the elements in it was I kept thinking, because at the time I had no idea Tolkien was even a believer, but I kept thinking, man, if a Christian ever actually became alive to the mystery of life and the power of words and the beauty of the world, maybe this is how he might write. And then I immediately said, no, it's not possible. No such thing could possibly be, because at that point I was in a pretty fundamentalist church and was really wrestling with issues like how do we know this is true? And it wasn't so much the lack of answers that bothered me as it was the attitude toward the questions.
Yeah.
If you were spiritual, you wouldn't be asking that. You just need to read your Bible harder and pray more. And then no, that wasn't helping.
Yeah.
And so what I needed was to see what I needed was a confirmation that a thoughtful Christian wasn't actually an oxymoron. A Christian thinking was actually what Christians are supposed to be like. And so I discovered Tolkien. Somebody said, if you like Tolkien, you should check out his friend C.S. Lewis, whose Christianity is not avoidable. And that was the moment that really turned my life around. Tolkien's Christianity is not as upfront and obvious as Lewis's. It's buried a little bit deeper beneath the surface, but it's definitely there. And I try to bring out the ways in which that's true in the book.
Yeah, that's excellent, and I can certainly relate. You mentioned kind of coming from a fundamentalist background, being within a fundamentalist church, and that's part of what our discussion is going to be about today is
Hmm.
fundamentalism. But I can certainly relate. I remember when I was in undergrad and being involved in college ministry. I remember the number of times that I would have fellow students who went to my church come up. They knew that I had this interest in apologetics, which had largely been sparked by going to a secular university, having professors that were just completely attacking Christianity, and then me going to church and nobody having answers for me,
Hmm.
really kind of mocking the professors who would attack Christianity without giving any kind of substantive response. And all I knew was the smartest people I've ever met, the professors at my university, think what I believe is foolishness, right? And so I had this strong desire to figure out, is there anything that would indicate that this stuff is true? And ultimately, thankfully, I was able to find good material that really kind of strengthened my faith. But what you were saying about the attitude towards it, and even the fact of asking questions in the first place, the number of times I had students approach me and tell me, hey, I was wondering about this. I want to let you know I'm not doubting my faith or anything, but this is something that's been bothering me. And I remember just asking a lot of them, what if you are doubting your faith? Like, would that be the end of the world? Like, sometimes doubts can launch us into fruitful investigation. And so
Hmm.
it's not the end of the world if we're having some doubts. I think
Yeah.
Christianity can handle them. Um,
In in the summer of '68, I didn't even know there was such a thing as a worldview. I learned that word from Francis Schaeffer the following year. But Tolkien got me started in the process of acquiring a biblical worldview before I even knew there was such a thing. And Schaeffer and Lewis helped him finish the job. But it was Tolkien that got me started because after The Lord of the Rings, I grabbed everything else by him I could find. And that included the essay on fairy stories, in which he explains his idea of subcreation. Human beings are creative because we're created in the image of the creator. And that idea was like, oh my goodness, this is the image of God. This is the imago Dei. This is explicitly Christian doctrine. And this guy not only believes it, he uses it as a tool to understand the world. And I thought, oh my goodness, you can do that? I want to do that. And I've been trying to do it ever since.
Outstanding. Awesome. Yeah. What you just said reminds me of something I read recently. I've been reading through a book by Leland Ryken, where he basically is laying out a kind of Christian aesthetic. And he actually makes the point, and I had never noticed this before. He says, if we're reading Genesis 1 for the first time, right? And he's not limiting it to this.
Mm-hmm.
He says all we know in Genesis 1, when man and when humanity is made in the image of God, all we know to this point about God is that he is a creator. And so minimally, the fact that we're made in God's image has to mean something regarding our creativity. Now, he wouldn't limit it to that, and I wouldn't limit it to that, but certainly that has to play a role in the image of God that we bear.
I think Lee's on the right track there. We actually know two things at that point. We know that God's creative, and we know that he's articulate because he creates through language. He speaks the world into existence. Then he uses language not only to give it existence, but to give it form, dividing the light from the darkness, the waters above, the firmament from the waters below, the sea from the dry land. And he uses language to give it value because he looks at what he made and he said, this is good. In the beginning, God made light. There'd never been any photons before. God creates light, and God looks at the light and he says, man, this is good stuff. I like this stuff. I'm going to make some more of this. This is good. God, through his word, gives the world existence, form, and value. And then when man is created in his image, that's what's in the foreground of the story. And lo and behold, man is the first creature that we meet that God talks to, and Adam talks back. Adam's first official act is to create the first human language, because God brings the animals and Adam names them. Adam makes up the words, and God says, cool, we'll use that word, you know? And so creativity and language. And the interesting thing about that is that creativity is what separates human language from all other forms of animal communication. They've studied, different animals that have various rather sophisticated means of communication, like the honeybee with its dance. There was a tribe of monkeys that was determined to have 60 sounds. I won't call them words, but 60 sounds they could use to communicate different ideas that were relevant to the life of monkey, like food, danger. I'll pick your ticks off if you pick mine. But the monkeys never, 60 words is a pretty big vocabulary for an animal, but it wouldn't have mattered if it was 600 or 6,000, because what they never did was, no monkey ever made up a new sound to communicate a new idea that had never before entered into the mind of monkey. No monkey ever combined the old sounds into new combinations to create new ideas. Human beings do that effortlessly, and we don't realize what a miracle it is. But there it is. It's the image of God, which is our creativity and our language, exactly what Genesis tells us in context. And all of the other attributes of humanity that we think of as being part of the image of God ultimately relate back to that. Yeah. We have a moral nature. Why? Well, because we were given the ability to create language. That means that unlike any other physical animal on the planet, we can render an account of our stewardship. That's what gives us a moral nature, is language. It enables us to think rationally in a way that other species can't match. It all makes perfectly good sense. So I think Lee's absolutely on the right track. Most theologians don't bother reading the story as a story in context. But there may be actually a little bit more to it even than what he was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. And I certainly appreciate that. I remember being in my undergrad, my minor was in anthropology. So I had to take all these human evolution classes. And I remember sitting in class one day while the students and the professor were discussing what is it that really makes man different from the other animals, right? And they're trying to be as reductionistic as possible. Mm-hmm. And they just conclude that ultimately the only difference is language. And I'm thinking, that's a huge difference. Yeah. Because it's the difference between them being out there and us being in here talking about the difference between us and them, right? Mm-hmm. Like no other species of animal is discussing what is different about them compared to us. Right. We're the only species doing it, and so that's a big difference. We can't just brush language, like as if it's a mere, small difference, a small distinction, or as if it doesn't carry any kind of value with it.
Their insight is valid as far as it goes. That is, language is the key to the difference. But as you say, it's not a reductionistic thing. It's huge. Right. It's a world opening. It's a window opening thing. And it's absolutely huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me go ahead and give kind of the quote that came up. So I had become Facebook friends with Dr. Williams when you were the president of the International Society of Christian Apologetics.
That's right.
That was a few years ago now. Yeah. And so back a few months, you made a post, and it was around the time that I was starting this channel. I was sharing this with you before we started the interview, and it just jumped out to me in saying, I even bigger than the YouTube channel. So it definitely was what I wanted my YouTube channel to be about. But in a much bigger sense, I believe it's the calling that God has placed on my teaching and on my ministry is to help our culture with this particular issue. And this is what you put out for discussion. And I thanked you before the interview for thinking out loud, because I do think we benefit from people kind of challenging us to think about these kinds of things. For all of the shortcomings of social media, I do find these kinds of things to be something that's redeeming in social media. And so this is what you wrote. You said, thesis, the challenge for faithful Christians in America is to correct what was wrong in fundamentalism while preserving what was right in that movement. The emergents and the post-evangelicals try to do the former while neglecting the latter. The evangelicals and the neo-fundamentalists try to do the latter while failing sufficiently to do the former. The best role model we have who do both, not perfectly, but with integrity, was Francis Schaeffer. And then you ask the question, what should following in his footsteps look like today? And so for our viewers and listeners, if you don't mind, can you tell us, what is the fundamentalism you're referring to? What is the fundamentalist?
Yeah, we have
to you referring to them in this post.
Yeah, to understand that, we have to understand the history of fundamentalism. It was a reaction against the drift, the theological drift in the mainline Protestant denominations at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, as many of their pastors, many of their missionaries, many of their seminary professors were moving away from historic orthodoxy, accepting the results of negative biblical criticism. And so a number of leaders, pastors, and scholars in various denominations, including people like J. Gresham Machen, B.B. Warfield, came together, and they came together around what were called the 5 fundamentals of the faith. And that's where the movement took its name, from the 5 fundamentals. And they were the inspiration and the authority of the scriptures, the deity and virgin birth of Christ, the historicity of the New Testament miracles, especially the virgin birth and the resurrection, bodily, physical, literal resurrection from the dead of Christ. Number 4 was the vicarious substitutionary atonement requiring the shedding of Christ's blood. Number 5 was a personal and literal return or second coming of Christ in the future. They didn't specify if that was pre-mill, a-mill, post-mill, pre-trib, mid-trib, or post-trib, but you had to believe Jesus was coming back. And the thrust of it was 2 things. Number 1, these 5 doctrines are true, and if you don't believe that, you're not really a Christian. And secondly, these 5 doctrines are not only true, they are essential to faithful Christianity. So if you deny the inspiration of the scriptures, the deity of Christ, the reality of the miracles he performed, including and especially the virgin birth, which he didn't exactly perform, but that and the resurrection, if you deny atonement requiring the shedding of his blood and the second coming, whatever you call yourself, it doesn't matter if you have a steeple on your building, it's not Christianity anymore. And so the desire was to defend those 5 doctrines as being A, true, and B, essential to faithful historic Christianity.
And just for our viewers' sake, that would be kind of the positive aspect of fundamentalism that you were saying needed to be preserved. Like that part, you and I both agree that is essential. Those are the fundamentals of Christianity.
Right. They had the idea that these 5 things are true and essential, and that they needed to be defended with scholarly rigor. And the guys who wrote the 4-volume original set of fundamentalist pamphlets were people who really tried to do that, and many of them did a great job. As the movement progressed, it came into some practical issues that it had to deal with. For example, J. Gresham Machen was defrocked by the liberal Presbyterian Church for insisting on bringing these issues up. And well, the thing that got him in trouble was he said, look, we got to stop supporting missionaries with our tithes that go out and don't preach the gospel. And so he set up an independent board for Presbyterian missions. He happened to be a Presbyterian. And the denominational hierarchy ordered them to shut it down. He refused, and so he ends up getting kicked out. So he started the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and Westminster Seminary. And you had this thing of, it had come to the point where trying to reform the mainline liberal denominations wasn't working. And with the defrocking of Machen, it was kind of like people felt like their hands had been forced. And so conservatives and fundamentalists in droves started coming out of the liberal denominations and starting smaller conservative denominations that were faithful to historic Christianity and that would practice church discipline. One of the big issues with the liberal churches was not only were they not teaching it, but you couldn't discipline people who were essentially heretics. Once they started coming out, then the issue of separation or separatism arose. Those who came out, many of them said, okay, the liberal denominations are so corrupt, you cannot be faithful to Christianity in them anymore. Christians need to come out of them. So that was separatism. We need to be separate. Come ye out from among them and be ye separate, says the Lord. But what then do you do with those who decided to stay in? Your fellow fundamentalists, which at this time, fundamentalist just means a Christian, a real Christian. What do you do with those who decided to stay in? Because some people said, oh my goodness, we've got so much invested in these churches, in these groups, and we think we should continue to work for reform from within, no matter how hopeless it looks. We think that's our calling. And the guys who came out, some of them felt betrayed by the guys who didn't come with them. And so it was separatism versus non-separatism. And then in the separatist camp, there arose a disagreement over what was called secondary separation. All right, separatism means we believe we should not participate in a denomination or a church that's lost its theological integrity. We should come out and form a church that's still faithful. Secondary separation is the idea you not only separate from liberals, you separate from Christians who aren't as separated as you are. And so our fellow fundamentalists who had stayed in were now considered to be traitors to the movement and worse than the liberals because they should have known better. They know better. Consequently, they're worse than the liberals themselves who don't know any better. And so the fundamentalist movement then begins to divide into two wings. The secondary separatist wing, unfortunately, has kept the name fundamentalists. So today, when you say fundamentalism, people think about a very, very rigorous, strong doctrine of secondary separation. And the non-separatist and the non-secondary separatist group became known as neo-evangelicals and then just evangelicals. So evangelicals have the fundamentalist movement as part of their heritage. Okay? Well, Francis Schaeffer is a really interesting guy because he was part of that secondary separatist wing. And he came to a point where he began to realize that that was a mistake because they were so negative, they were so legalistic, they were so bitter against those who weren't secondary separatists that they had really forgotten how to speak the truth in love, and they had become focused on secondary issues. And so, oh my goodness, that's just not biblical Christianity any more than liberalism is. And then, but some of the evangelicals had become so compromised by the compromises they had to make to stay in, that Schaeffer said, we just can't accept that either of those solutions is good enough. We have to stand for the truth with full integrity, but we have to speak the truth in love. And so that crisis that Schaeffer went through in the late 40s into about 1950, 51 was the prelude to the founding of L'Abri Fellowship and Schaeffer's ministry, which was then based on giving honest answers to honest questions. So there was the apologetic element, and also speaking the truth in love. We have to manifest the full character of God, both his holiness and his love. It can't be one or the other. Well,
you actually, real quick, you have a
Yeah.
fantastic blog article on truth and love,
Mm-hmm.
and the challenges of carrying that balance, and how oftentimes it's the impossibility of doing that really well. That's kind of a humbling experience for us as Christians, constantly having to rely on the grace of God to kind of accomplish that. So I will make sure to link that blog post.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. It's not impossible to do it, and it's not impossible to do it well, but it is impossible to do it in the flesh. In the flesh, I can speak the truth, and man, I can kick atheists' butt, and I can take my sword and I can carve their hearts out and eat them and do more harm than good. In the flesh, I can be nice and accommodating and courteous and wonderful. In the flesh, I cannot speak the truth in love. I end up compromising one or the other if I try to do it in my own wisdom. So it absolutely throws us back on the necessity of dying to self and living to Christ and living in dependence on the power of the Holy Spirit to enable us to do what in my own nature I simply can't do. Yeah, and as I read the scriptures, I got a feeling that what's true of me is true of people in general.
Yes, it's a human condition. It is. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so when you mentioned Schaeffer in your original post, is that what you were referring to? That Schaeffer did a good job of valuing truth, preserving the truth, but then communicating it to his particular cultural context in a way that was loving and that truly had a desire to connect with the culture that he found himself in.
That's definitely a big part of it. And there's another side to it, not quite as important, but equally. Now, here I go contradicting myself. It's either equal or it's not. Very important also. And that is fundamentalism, as it moved into its more secondary separatist phase, tended to also become anti-intellectual. And Schaeffer embodied, when it didn't become anti-intellectual, it became very narrowly sectarian in its intellectual rigor. And Schaeffer embodied this idea of the lordship of Christ over the total culture. Christians needed to be interested in art and music and literature and culture in general, and they needed to be salt and light in these areas and not just withdraw into their separatist ghetto and ignore these things. And so there was a healthiness to Schaeffer's spirituality in terms of not compromising either truth or love. At the same time, there was a holisticness to it that was very not typical of fundamentalists or evangelicals on the popular level when he came along.
And that right there to me is so key, and I'm so glad you brought it up. It is where I wanted to go. Is there a sense in which, and I mean, you served as president of the International Society for Christian Apologetics, so obviously, you appreciate a lot of the guys that are involved in that kind of an organization, a lot of the works that are produced. But what I find to be so incredibly important about Schaeffer, and then about some of the guys you've dedicated a lot of your work and research to, the Lewises, the Tolkiens, is that there was a holistic nature to it. I wonder if perhaps fundamentalism, in a certain way, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this, almost bought into the rationalism of the modernist movement that they were trying to reject, and in a way became very narrow in their focus, almost a hyper-literalism when it came to reading the scriptures and those kinds of things, and rejected kind of the holistic approach to the human being. And guys like Schaeffer, G.K. Chesterton, I think, certainly would have played a role in this, but your Lewises, your Tolkiens, were trying to recapture a certain kind of enchantment that the Christian should have when they're viewing a world that is made by the God of the Bible.
I think some of them may have done that. But if you go back to Machen, for example, if you read Machen on education, or Machen even on evangelism, Schaeffer was really reconnecting with fundamentalist roots. And if fundamentalism became, to the extent that it became narrow, because in many ways it did, it was departing from its own heritage. And that was sad. Part of it was the Scopes trial. Clarence Darrow made William Jennings Bryan, who was at the end of his life and his powers were failing. He wasn't at his best, but he made him look so bad. It was so embarrassing to conservative Christians that they kind of just went into a shell. And the separatistic tendency got multiplied and magnified, and they ended up withdrawing not just from liberal churches, but from practically the entire the culture in the world. And there were and are some people who I think did absorb more of rationalism than was good for them. But I hesitate to make a blanket statement like that, because I can think of a lot of exceptions. And, the current postmodernists and emergents tend to blame everything on evangelicalism also having bought into rationalism. And if it wasn't so damaging, it would be funny, because people like Gordon Clark and Carl F. H. Henry were refuting rationalism before it was cool to do so. But they didn't throw out the rational baby with the rationalistic bathwater like the postmodern guys do.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I think that's a fair distinction to make, that certainly there were some that were already noticing kind of the problems with the rationalist kind of movement and tendency. I guess I think of, as a lot of times Christians in the more fundamentalist camp, right? So you're right. The postmoderns see the rationalism, the modernism as this terrible thing. I guess I've seen in fundamentalism certain stripes of it lean more towards the rationalism, although again, seeing the Enlightenment as kind of a bad thing, in a way, absorbing the Enlightenment way of viewing the world. And then you have certain Christian, and I'll use this term for lack of a better term, but Christian romantics, in a sense, your Chestertons, your Lewis, the guys that are kind of fascinated with the world, kind of respond and push back against that in saying, like, there's truth that is being communicated in more ways than just propositions, and in more way than just a written word or even a spoken word, but art communicates something, literature communicates something, that there's a sense in which truth is communicated even in fairy stories, and sometimes much deeper truths are communicated through this. And
Yeah,
so
the
yeah,
biblical view of truth is more than propositional, but it's not less.
absolutely, yeah.
And I constantly am reminded of Martin Luther's definition of human history as the story of a drunk man staggering from one wall of an alley to the other as he tries to make his way down to the opposite end. Because, you know, we overemphasize the propositional, and then we rubber band from that to practically thinking propositional truth is a bad thing.
Right.
And
Yes.
the biblical idea is that truth, of course, both the Old Testament word for truth, emeth, and the New Testament word aletheia, both have as their root meaning faithfulness. Truth is faithfulness. It's faithfulness to the facts. That's propositional truth. And unfortunately, modernism kind of reduced truth to that. But biblical truth includes that. But biblical truth is more than just faithfulness to the facts. It's faithfulness to God, faithfulness to the covenant, faithfulness to your neighbor, which includes faithfulness to the facts. So you're faithful to the facts in such a way, being faithful to God, to the covenant, and to your neighbor. So gossip is false speech, even if it's technically true what you're saying, because it's not faithful to your neighbor. It lacks the full orbed completeness of biblical faithfulness. So yeah, truth is more than propositional, but it's not less. If you make it less, then you don't have a biblical concept of truth anymore, where if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, in cold hard fact, in space-time history, propositionally, we are of all men most miserable. Yeah. If we could just get people to, to stop with the rubber band effect and reacting to one error by creating its equal and opposite form. And yeah, it's exactly what I see the postmodern guys doing with modernism.
And that's exactly why I thought just what you stated in that original post and then in what we've been talking about today was just so important to our culture today, because it's that temptation that you were talking about. And I was thinking of the Luther quote as well. It's this idea that in almost an overreaction to fundamentalism, we lose all of the value that they had preserved in American Christianity. And really what we end up with is something that looks like nothing like Christianity. We just call it that. And so I think that's exactly the key. And as someone who, if we use the kind of traditional, or at least the most common kind of way of breaking it up, right? Everybody's blogging and writing articles about millennials. And so if we say, okay, those born from 82 to 2004, that seems to be kind of that range. Every time I see that on social media, because it's become so popular to do, I'm within that gap. And so it's like people are speaking about me and my peers. And so as I think about that, I would say that that is something that concerns me about my own generation, is the overreaction to the fundamentalism, and where that's leading, where that has led. But I do also believe that one of the promising things of the millennial generation is that they are, I think, primed and ready to be enamored with your Chestertons, Lewises, and Tolkiens, because of the stories they tell and because of the more holistic, kind of fully orbed Christianity that they present.
I hope you're right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't run into a generation yet that I wanted to identify with, including my own.
Right.
I mean, the baby boomers,
Yeah.
we're a disaster. And all the problems of the generations after us are probably our fault.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we raised the busters and they raised the millennials. And
Yeah.
now we've got this mess, you know. So, but when I find somebody who loves the right things for the right reasons, I don't care how old they are, that person is my friend.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in closing here, my question to you, you're an educator, I'm an educator. What are the kinds of things that you encourage your students, the kinds of things that you try and model for your students, for your community, that you think can help us better kind of navigate in the way of this kind of third way, right? Where we hold to those fundamental truths of Christianity unapologetically, right? In a way that we don't have to be ashamed of the gospel or the truths that it contains. We are giving rigorous defense of Christianity, but also loving our culture, but in a deeper way, like you mentioned with Schaeffer, and Schaeffer was one of those guys when I read Art in the Bible. That was one of the books that just kind of helped me even get categories for the field of aesthetics. What are some of the ways that we can do that? Because I think sometimes when we go down this road of apologetics, and my master's degree is in apologetics, I got it through Biola University. I'm thankful I did. I appreciate those arguments. But sometimes I think that they're kind of one-sided in the sense that unless you're an extremely kind of heady person that's willing to read textbooks for fun, you get lost in that mix a little bit. And so how might you encourage Christians who want to think deeply about their faith, but maybe aren't going to be reading 700 pages at a time of rigorous argumentation?
We've got to get back to the basics. When I was 17, I did need to read my Bible and pray more. That wasn't a sufficient answer to the questions I had, but it wasn't false. But I needed to have my question of how do we know this is true, and why are you so afraid of my questions? How can this be true if you're insecure about truth and aren't willing to engage with the world? It's like you're afraid you're going to get refuted. So why should I believe you? I needed to get past those things so that I could go back and go back to the basics and meet Christ with the barriers that have been created by the anti-intellectualism of the fundamentalist subculture stripped away. Jesus is the one who said that the great commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. Oh, wow. What I need to do is strip away the veneer. It's like the Gospels give us this portrait of Christ, and it's like this beautiful Renaissance painting, but there's 400 years of dust and grime and oil and veneer paint that's collected over it. And we need to strip that away so we can get back to meeting Jesus as he was. And there's no substitute for that. And so when I meet Jesus, who is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, and who is also the Word of God who was spoken before the world began, and who coming into the world enlightens every man, now I can start relating to all of life, and to art and music and literature and philosophy and thinking in a healthy way again. We have to remember that a negative photograph of Jesus, now a negative photograph of the world is not necessarily a positive portrait of Jesus. I think that's one of the mistakes fundamentalism made is, oh, let's be different from the world. Well, yeah, we should in lots of ways.
Yeah.
But you don't just do the opposite of what the world is doing. That doesn't necessarily make you like Jesus. You have to get back to the place where the Bible can really speak for itself again and reach us. And then we need a vast revolution to our Christian subculture and our church culture. We need to get back to real expository preaching that is expository and sound and connects with life. It's the application of the whole counsel of God to all of life. Man, I don't see 1 in 20 or 30 evangelical pastors who even have that as a vision, much less are attaining it. And my students pick up all kinds of bad habits, not only of grammar, but also of thinking from their preachers and their youth leaders, who are completely and totally just focused on trying to maintain a certain emotional state, create and maintain a certain state of emotions. Well, that not only atrophies your brain, it jades you emotionally. If you want me to feel something, the last thing you need to do is try to manipulate me into feeling about it. Good. Let me see Jesus, and then let my emotions respond naturally to who he is. Take the veil away. Take the blinders off. Show me the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Be focused on that. And then I have a chance to respond from the very depths of my heart and my soul. So I think that, we do a lot of praying for revival, and rightly so. We desperately need revival. But I've become convinced that what we really need now is a new reformation. And before that, a renaissance. Renaissance is a recovery of the life of the mind.
Yes.
Reformation is a recovery of sound doctrine. Revival is a recovery of vital spirituality. You're not going to get the last one if you ignore the first two. And so I think we need to keep praying revival, but we need to start working for Renaissance and Reformation. And I think that's really where we are as a movement today.
That is outstanding. And certainly, I agree wholeheartedly. And this is actually something that I try and communicate to my students as we tackle through different issues. I teach humanities, and so I give them the big picture, and we spend time on the Renaissance. I think a lot of times the Renaissance period, what's emphasized, and it's not false, but what's emphasized is some of the moral decay, some of the corruption that was going on in the church. But I've taken to emphasizing to my students, yes, this was occurring, but Christian humanism was born here. And I think we're in desperate need of true Christian humanists that care about the humane subjects in a biblical way.
It was Renaissance humanist scholars who recovered grammatico-historical exegesis. Luther and Calvin learned that from them. Yeah. And that was what opened up the scriptures so that they could actually see the gospel. Why were Luther and Calvin successful in turning the world upside down when Wycliffe and Huss only had a few disciples and a faithful remnant? Well, everybody knows between Wycliffe and Huss and the Reformation came the printing press, and that was a really, really big help. What people don't realize is between Wycliffe and Huss and Luther and Calvin came Renaissance humanism with its ad fontes, back to the sources tradition, its recovery of interest in reading ancient works in the original languages, using and understanding in terms of the history of their own time. That was the hermeneutic that let the Bible speak for itself again in a way that people could hear. And so what Luther and Calvin could do that Wycliffe and Huss couldn't do, they could appeal to scholarly methodologies that, based on what was now becoming common sense in Europe, Let them explain why the Bible said what they said it said, and not what the Pope said it said.
Yeah.
That's what they could do that Wycliffe and Huss couldn't do. So the Renaissance was more critical to the Reformation. In some ways, it was a rival to the Reformation because it had a secular side to it as well. But it was critical to the Reformation's ability to happen. And Martin Luther realized that. Martin Luther wrote in a letter to Eoban Hesse, he said, whenever God wishes to break forth more truth out of his holy word, he prepares the way by the rise of languages and letters as if they were John the Baptist's.
Wow.
That's Martin Luther acknowledging the debt that the Reformation owed to the Renaissance.
Yeah.
So
No,
when I say we need Renaissance, Reformation, and revival, it's the whole package, and we're not going to get it unless we begin to understand that again.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. I think in reading Luther and Calvin, you see the humanist tradition in their writings, the way that they could interact with even non-biblical writings, even ancient writings that they valued and thought there was still, all truth being God's truth, there was benefit in understanding them and in knowing what the authors intended to write. So excellent. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with me today and for being willing to do this interview. I'm encouraged, and I also believe this will be helpful to others.
My pleasure. I hope it will.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, so make sure to check out the links that I put down below. I will be putting Dr. Williams' blog post that I made mention of earlier, as well as a link to some of the books that he's written most recently and to his website. All right. Until next time, God bless.